Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Finding Islam podcast. This is episode 7. I'm your host, Abir, and I'm joined with Muhammad and Zan, part of the FI team. And today we're going to be discussing, secularism, kind of talking about the many valid critiques of it, as well as the attempts that have been made and seem to continue to be made to secularize Islam, aspects of Islam, or Muslim countries in general. So yeah, I think we'll just kick off with this right here, and this is a topic that really you two in general are more kind of well versed in than myself. So Marie, do you want to just kind of kick us off with it?
Yeah, inshallah, not a problem. I did my master's dissertation actually on secularism, and that's where I kind of got a lot of this reading and information and research done on secularism, especially secularism in the Islamic context. All of this really begins with the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s, and this figure, Ali Abdel Razak, who in Egypt is an Azhari scholar, graduated from Al Azhar, did further education and studies in Oxford, returns to Egypt in the mid 1920s, or he's been in Egypt in the 1920s, and argues for the first time that Khilafah is not necessary, that Caliphate is not a requirement on the believers. And this argument, in hindsight, seems to be the first argument for a secular Islamic world. And the thing with Razak, though, is that he's operating in a very specific context, which is the context of the Egyptian monarchy attempting to lay claim to the Khilafah. And he was actually in the politics of Egypt involved in resistance to the monarchy and monarchic rule in favor of a democracy, a constitutional democracy. And so this fits in within his broader political career, but in terms of a singular book and a single kind of attack, you could say, on the century-old institution of the Islamic Caliphate, and the argument that we don't need it, and that instead we are free to choose how we see fit from the different political systems. This becomes the kind of opening salvo in among many different ones. But the opening salvo of this push to secularize the Islamic world, to separate between the religious and the mundane or the non-religious. And this line of a stark kind of separation between the things that are religious in nature and everything else begins begins with Abdul Razak. It's continued, some would argue, by the work of other reformist figures like Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, and Afghani. And so some people will retroactively ascribe these thinkers to be secularist thinkers, though they are much more complicated and we can't really do any of them justice in a very short amount of time. But there begins, right, in the post-Ottoman world, this question of how do we move forward? And one question that people have turned to, or one answer that people have turned to, is to secularize, to separate between deen and dunya, to put the religion on the one hand and politics on the other, and the rest of life. And this begs a number of questions, like what is secularism in itself? And then why should we secularize? The question of what is secularism is painfully difficult to define, because even amongst scholars of secularism and secularization, there is no consensus on a single definition. Instead, you have 3 definitions. And you'll notice that each one kind of has its own role to play, and 2 of them are, and they're all, for the most part, wrapped up in Europe and Europe's experience of secularization. And that's why, according to most major theorists of secularism, there are many exceptions, right? Each theorist comes up with essentially an argument of secularization that only really works in a very localized region or a localized kind of context. And when you try to universalize it, it falls apart. So the first definition of secularism, which is the oldest, is this separation or extraction of non-religious materials from the frame of the religious, or from the sphere of the religious. And this goes back to the extraction of property from under church authority in medieval Europe to the commons, and the slow kind of bit by bit taking things from kind of wider the rest of life away from the church, until all the church was left with was this narrowly defined space of what was considered to be religious, right? Things that are matters that are ethical and spiritual. Social critiques were kind of minimized, the role of religion in society removed, kind of the exercise of the church of material power, land and military and money, was pushed to the side in favor of new disciplines. Religious explanations or pseudo-religious explanations for the understanding of the world would be replaced by science, and like economics and politics, and all of these modern disciplines of study kind of are born in this wrestling away of essentially the authority to discuss about the world from the church. And that ultimately has to deal with the first definition of secularism, which is a very kind of, it's rooted in European history. A second definition of secularism has to do with the separation of church and state. And this one has to deal more with political discussion. And how do we organize a modern society in the way that best fits all people? The issue with this definition, though, is that there are a number of exceptions. America is a major exception to this, or rather, not necessarily, So American, the American model seems to be an exception in that the American people are a very religious people. America began from its earliest days as a settlement based on religious freedom and the religiosity of its people. The Puritans in Massachusetts and the Pilgrims as well across like the first generation of American settlers were here to build a religious utopia. And that dream, while it may have changed and transformed, the bedrock of American society is still Christian, even though its government is still secular. Actually, that is a critique of the third theory of secularism, which is the decline in religious belief over time. And this is seen by its kind of proponents as a universal symbol of human development. As people understand more and learn more and study the natural world, they begin to shed these outdated, outmoded, kind of superstitious beliefs of the past, right? We no longer need God to explain the world. We no longer need religious authorities to give us morality. We no longer need these kind of ancient systems, and we can enter into a more rational age where we are guided by philosophy and exist in the secular world where the ancient religious divisions no longer divide us. America is an exception to that, though, in that the American people are a very heavily religious people. They're a very Christian people. And that may be changing in more recent times, but back when these ideas were articulated in like the 1900s, America was seen as an exception to this. Because while in Europe religious fervor may have been declining, in America it had maintained, right? It was staying. But no one ever thought that America was somehow less secular. And the same thing, there's a critique of the second theory of separation of church and state. In England, the Queen remains the head of the Anglican Church. Yet England, despite this, remains to be a model kind of, well, that may be changing in recent times as well, but is considered a model secular democracy. And this applies to both America and the UK. And so there's no real single definition of secularism. And instead, you'll find that politicians and political analysts and whatnot will swap between the three depending on kind of circumstance and also the points that they're trying to prove. Which makes this whole idea of trying to secularize the Islamic world more difficult, because what is it? Is it a matter of political organizations? Is it a matter of the decline of religious kind of fervor in the Islamic world? Or is it adopting more modern understandings of the world? And the issue is that secularism, part of the reason why it's so kind of important is that secularism is seen as a precondition on becoming a liberal democracy. And I mean, if we're questioning secularism, it would be unfair of us to not question the question of why should we become a liberal democracy? Is a secular liberal democracy a valid goal, or is it a good goal in the first place? But it's seen as a precondition of becoming a liberal democracy. And all of this is tied up with the state of being modern. To secularize is to modernize, right? You can't be modern without being secular. And then there are debates of like how possible is it to not be secular in a secularized world, but those are kind of broader, deeper discussions for another time. I don't know if you wanted to jump in on anything, Zane.
You just went through like so much, so there's a bunch of other things I wanted to comment on, but
yeah, we can go back to any point.
So far, I almost don't want to backtrack.
No, it was kind of just I had intended it to be a rough outline, and we can jump through any of those points.
I think one thing, just to kind of jump in on it, is that I find interesting because I don't think a lot of lay people kind of even know that, Marie, in terms of what you how you went through it. There's multiple definitions of secularism depending on even how you look at it. I think most people at the very basic level probably understand the definition of it being basically separation of church and state. That I think is the most common. It's probably fair to say that's the most common understanding of it.
It is,
and it's interesting as well because it's a very European model, I suppose. Like in terms of its origin, and even like when you mentioned kind of its kind of I guess initial inception into kind of Egypt near the end of the Ottoman Empire, how at least initially it was coming from people who from individuals who had studied in the European environment as well. And that reminds me a bit of Pakistan as well, because Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a student of Oxford as well, which you kind of see similarities of kind of the governance of Pakistan as well, and how it's ran as a state comparatively to probably a lot of secular states as well. So to me, that would be one kind of initial, I guess, problem you could say, is how it's a very European idea. And just, what might work or what makes sense in a European climate doesn't automatically translate to Egypt, Pakistan, or even a Muslim nation, where the dynamics are completely different.
Even other nations in general, scholars of secularism have pointed out how their models don't apply to China, don't apply to Japan, don't apply to Asia, because the entire dynamic between religion and society is entirely different. And I think it's Jose Casanova who argues that when it comes to religion, there can be no general rules. Yet, despite this, politicians every day, right, you'll hear someone talking about the need to secularize the Middle East. The religious tensions and religiosity is the problem of the Middle East. And if only that we could kind of bring the Middle East into a modern, liberal, secular world, we could deal with these problems kind of rationally and remove them. But the question is, what is secularism? Because Muslim scholars are split on the opinion of kind of separating church from state, or even like democracy. Is it simply that we have scholars on the one hand and politicians on the other hand, and it's a very a very practical division of society, in which case it can be achieved quite simply, right? To say that we have politicians who are not kind of religious scholars, and then we have religious scholars on the other hand, and laws are made through kind of political machines as opposed to coming down as religious edicts. And this is where a lot of modern Islamic secularist scholars argue that you can have what they call double consensus, a consensus based on secular politics and then a consensus on religion, that Muslims can have ideas and articulate these ideas politically without using Islam and halal and haram as the language used to debate these. Because the minute you do that, you can't have a discussion around these policies. So if you say the Islamic opinion on X issue, X modern issue, is ABCD, that's a hard line. No one can now debate the validity of that ruling. But if you say this is what we believe Islamically and here are the political merits of this solution, then you can debate the political merits, you can debate the practicality of this policy, and then kind of work on creating a double consensus where the laws themselves are not. The laws themselves may be based in Islamic rulings, but the rationale that's kind of used to enact these policies is secular and political. So that's offered by some, I believe, like Abdullah Na'im, as a way to kind of merge and create this Islamic secular future. But that debates, I mean, that assumes that secularization is the way.
And at this point, Marie, are we seeing? I guess are we seeing alternatives really? Because like so far, I feel like uh, the aim still seems to be secularization from what I'm seeing. Like in most kind of Muslim countries anyway. Despite the fact that you know a lot of these countries are not really doing well. Like if you look right now, for example, Turkey is economically is struggling. Pakistan economically is struggling, and this is coming off the back of many other issues that both these kind of countries have had for years. I mean, especially I guess you could say Turkey, because of course Turkey after under Ataturk was very very secular. So are there attempts being made to really kind of challenge the idea?
Change.
Yeah. Or kind of change beyond kind of the attempt to secularize.
Yeah. So this is where you get into kind of like views of, or like very interesting and differing trends. So in the Arab world, there has been recently, or less recently rather, in the early 2000s, this push for more Islamic governance under Muslim Brotherhood style or related kind of groups. You had the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, you had the Ennahda in Tunisia, is it Tunisia? Yeah, Tunisia, I believe. And these different kind of groups coming to power, promising Islamic governance. And this very paradoxical trend that these groups themselves, while in power, secularize. They kind of backtrack from their initial kind of promises of a more robust Islamic governance in line with traditional conceptions of the Sharia, and develop more liberal democratic frameworks in these countries. But then Turkey is also an interesting case because you had heavy-handed secularization of society. And this is also kind of a point that secularism does not necessarily is not necessarily a marker of a democratic, liberal kind of society, because in the Soviet Union you had authoritarian secularism. In Turkey, again, you had authoritarian secularism. But in recent years, especially under Erdogan and the AKP, there has been a push to kind of re-Islamize society, to remove older bans on religious practice in Turkish society. And to re-Islamize society, except that this hasn't overturned the democratic nature of the Turkish government. Kind of criticisms of Erdogan and his regime aside, Turkey remains, at its core, regardless of the religiosity of its people nowadays, a secular democratic country, though it may not have a shining record. But I can't speak to that because I don't specialize in Turkish politics, so I wouldn't know. But there's also been waves of Islamic Brotherhood or Muslim Brotherhood politicians coming to power in Pakistan and Malaysia and across the Islamic world, offering or promising some return to kind of Islamically inspired, if not derived exactly from the traditions of Islam, government. And the success or failure of those movements is entirely dependent on kind of local politics. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's that's interesting. Zan, I might try and bring you in here. So I suppose because there's a lot to dissect, so kind of maybe like to kind of break it down a bit more. What are, I guess you could say, within these attempts to secularize Islam? What are some of the criticisms in your experience and from your readings that exist out there?
I suppose there's Perhaps the question is why do those attempts exist, and how do they come about? And I suppose there's perhaps there's two different dimensions that we can mention, um, and this might be they each in their own way. I suppose they correspond to the definitions that Marie gave. So one dimension is like is refers back to what Marie was saying about how like Ali Abdul Razak and other reformers were making this attempt to emulate perceived Euro American success in terms of economics and civilizational evolution, and they thought that we had to emulate them at a state level and a social level in terms of the implementation of secularism. And you can see this is something that was mirrored by a lot of other countries in the 19th and 20th centuries. It was the same way with Japan's Meiji Restoration, which was an attempt to modernize and their idea of modernizing was westernizing. And similarly, with China and their Cultural Revolution becoming a modern country, again, they very heavily embraced, communism, which again is a European Enlightenment ideology, as a means of entering into the modern world. So it's not something that's distinct to the Muslims. This desire to look outside of ourselves, specifically towards the West, for the answers to social and political organization as a means of success. So that's one, that sort of inward attempt, looking outward, and you can argue that often came from a place of inferiority, a sense of inferiority to the socio-political norms of the West, and a desire to, and also again the strength of their civilization and the strength of their culture, so that they had such a degree of influence over not only the Muslims but the rest of the world. So that's sort of the one dimension that's sort of coming from ourselves, our sense of inferiority, and the sort of desire to emulate the West. Yeah, that's one dimension, and I'll mention a second next. But I think
I was just going to say another element to not disregard is their military power, because the whole thing that sets off this whole this period of self-reflection is this feeling of inability to compete. And it's a common trend across the kind of Eastern world, if you were to say.
In Europe, you had yeah. I was going to say in Europe you had the sick man of Europe, which was Turkey, and then Asia you had sick man of Asia, which was China. And they both went through these massive social changes in the 20th century, and both of those social changes were geared towards adoption of European principles. And you totally right. Yeah, that's
and you had the entrance of the Americans into Japan kind of forcibly, and the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate and Meiji Restoration, and then the Japan's emergence, though, is an interesting one, because Japan emerges into the world scene as a capable regional power, especially into World War II. They industrialized, they modernized, but they attempted to not, or we can argue how much they did or didn't, but especially in the Meiji era, they remained fully Japanese. They maintained their culture, but they kind of reaped the benefits of modernization, at least from the outward sense, in terms of political organization and military strength, and went on to kind of craft an imperial empire in Asia.
But that's actually a great point to mention, because soft power and your ability to attract and influence, and often related to your cultural strength, is something that is very much comes in complement to your hard power, to your military and economic strength. So again, the military and economic strength of Euro-American actors definitely would have increased their cultural strength, their ability to influence and attract, and therefore bring people over to their way of thinking, which is why you had these attempts from the Muslim world and from the global south and other places to secularize. So that's the first dimension, which is really important to mention, I suppose. And then the second dimension, if unless you have if you fellas have anything to say on that,
we could quote Ibn Khaldun, but we wouldn't need to go there.
Go ahead.
I mean, Ibn Khaldun has this quote where he says something to the effect of, like, when one group loses to another, they ascribe their defeat not to their own weakness, but to the perfection of their enemy. And this is what inspires this kind of period of self-reflection with an eye towards kind of their own weaknesses, their own inferiority relative to the strength of their the one who beat them, and then the
Mhm.
adoption of their social norms and their political norms and
That's
whatnot.
very interesting. That's very
But yeah.
interesting. Yeah, and then that feeds in quite well. Ibn Khaldun was ahead of all these post-colonial theorists coming up with inferiority theories. It's not just a little lesson for everyone. But but yeah, so that's excellent. And then the second one, and it relates to something we were talking about, military and hard power, is just the interventionist attempts by Europe to impose their civilization and their norms on the rest of the world, on the global south through direct colonialism and to modern neocolonialism. Most post-colonial states from the 1950s and 60s onwards generally adopted uh, European nation states as their model of governance, and so that's why that became the global norm, and then that was obviously accompanied by secularism. So that's one is that interventionists attempt to spread their way of life, and that was obviously, like I was saying, is continued through neocolonialism. American interventions into Afghanistan and Iraq, both came at times of increasing Islamization of society. The coup in Egypt came again with the Muslim Brotherhood victory. Attempted coups in Turkey are on the back of increasing Islamic influence in Turkey. So you can see that whenever there is the in terms of the post-colonial age, in terms of the increasing strength of Islam, has seen attempts to correct, interventionist and imperial attempts to correct. And this, both in the colonial and post-colonial period, what's important to note is that this is very much inspired by sort of, European imperialism and European Orientalism, that exert control over the global South, and the desire to redesign and dissect and to create it in its own image. It's not a coincidence that after colonialism, Egypt and Libya and Iraq and Jordan all became monarchies, just like Britain, and Syria became a republic. Syria and Lebanon, I think, became republics like France. So it's not a coincidence that countries ended up adopting the governance norms of their colonizer. So that's the second dimension that I'd mention. But that first one, which is that inward, that inferiority, that cultural pressure, which causes you to enter into secularism or to any foreign ideology, and then that interventionist imperial dimension, that Orientalism, which is ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're seeing recent, most recent example of that is Afghanistan. Like the U.S. has spent so many resources, so much time and effort in attempting to manipulate and kind of inhabit that country for its own benefit. The funniest thing for me about that situation was I actually saw an article after they fled Afghanistan, basically saying that since the Taliban now controls the poppy fields, there's going to be less opium now in the U.S. But it was framed as if that's a bad thing. It's like, really, the opium market's going to get hit real bad. For anyone who invested in opium, it's time to get out now. But it's a perfect example, though. It's literally, it's all about control. It doesn't matter, whether it's good or bad. It's all about control. And personally, I'm curious, and I hope inshallah things improve for Afghanistan. There are people who are in a very, very difficult situation, economically and so on. But to kind of touch on, so we've touched on like some of the criticisms there regarding secularism, and well, we touched on kind of why attempts to secularize have been made. I suppose what I would ask is there a case now that we can kind of retrospectively look at like the Ottoman Empire and these things that kind of predated the rise of secularism, can a case be made to say that those systems, I don't think we, realistically speaking, in this era we could go back to a system like that, but can a case be made that overall that it was a better system, I suppose, for many of these nations than the attempts that have subsequently been made to secularize.
I have a response. I'm sure Marty was. You go first.
Okay, sure. I was going to say that the question perhaps wouldn't necessarily be like in terms of better or worse, but in terms of kind of more holistic and intrinsic, especially within the concept within the Islamic tradition. To secularize and modernize in the Islamic world brought with it a redefinition of the relationships between the state and people and the nature of the law, which, according to scholars like Wa'il Halaq, completely eroded and like undermined earlier understandings of the relationship between the state, the law, and the people. And he argues that a modern Islamic nation state is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. A state cannot fully apply Islamic law and remain a modern nation state, because in his understanding, and in the understanding of some other scholars of Islamic law, the law is separate from the state. It's not made by state agents. It's enforced by state agents, but that these agents also have a role outside the state. The traditional Islamic scholars were on and off in terms of their appointments as judges by state authorities. And their hiring or firing to official court positions did not change the validity of their legal positions. And you have this kind of evolution of law outside the system, applied on a very local level, as opposed to what you have nowadays with nation states, with a top-down imposition of law that is created by legislative bodies and adjudicated over by Supreme Courts, and applied in one way fairly to the best of their ability across an entire landscape. In the Islamic world, what you had was a diversity of legal systems with kind of locales and regions where local scholars adjudicated cases based on their own understandings, which were developed relative to Islamic principles, but also the cultures and customs of the people. And so rulings in Islamic Spain would have differed from rulings in Pakistan, would have differed from rulings in Egypt during their time periods pre kind of modernization. Now in the modern world, what you have, starting with the Ottoman Tanzimat, and you can see this with most other places, is the codification of Islamic law, taking the law that was traditionally in the hands of scholars into now the hands of politicians who codify a single set of rulings that would apply in all cases, from a minimum of at least like 4 acceptable answers, right? For every legal ruling, you can have, or for every legal case, you can have multiple rulings per the different schools of Islamic thought and the different methodologies of the scholars. But now that diversity of opinion has been narrowed down to a single concrete rule, which cannot be kind of debated, especially if we're going to argue that this codification of state law is in its essence Islamic. To then attack that law would be to attack its Islamic nature, at least according to some scholars.
Are you still answering the question?
Yeah, so the idea is that, like, is this better or worse? It's you can't compare apples and oranges. If we're going to argue, is the modern nation state, the modern secular democratic nation state system,
I think we should differentiate between secularism and the modern nation state, because I know you were mentioning, well, halak there, and that, I think that's an argument about how the potential lack of compatibility of Islam with the nation state itself. Well, I
was going to say, because the two are connected when it comes to modernizing, right? If we're going to critique the modern Islamic states and compare them with pre-modern Islamic states, the modern ones are secular or at least trying to be, right? Mm-hmm. Secular nation states with this kind of top-down application of Islamic law, which, according to some scholars, does a disservice to the Islamic law. Versus this pre-modern kind of bottom-up grassroots application of the law. And if we're going to judge like the secular modern system on its ability to perform the older style, then it's going to be found lacking, basically. The long-winded answer of saying, like, if we're going to judge the modern era and the modern states by their ability to do what existed beforehand, they're going to fail because they're not built to do that. They're built to run in one very specific way, where the state controls the law, and that's not how it was in the Islamic past, basically. That's TLDR.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot to process, I guess.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's interesting to be honest. And like, look, in fairness, this isn't really a topic where you can kind of just give little bite-sized answers. There's no easy. If there was an easy answer to this, we'd probably see more successful Muslim countries right now. It's
I
one of
mean,
the, one
you
of
can
those
I
things.
try.
I just on that point, I think it's been mentioned once or twice. I just would say that I wouldn't say that there aren't unsuccessful Muslim countries. I think I don't think we should get caught in this sort of this pessimism. A lot of Muslim countries have achieved a lot of impressive things, despite the many disadvantages placed upon them, and secularism and democracy aren't proven guarantors any sort of economic or cultural success. You know, Turkey's recent cultural success in terms of its media production is very much attributable to its Islamic heritage. Even during the 20th century and after the end of the Cold War and the sort of American triumphalism about their way of life as being the only way of life. In the 21st century, we've seen China, a communist state, destroy everyone in terms of economic growth. So and again, that's just another proof that there is no one model of guaranteed to bring success. So so just on that sort of point that I think there are plenty of good things that have come out of Muslim countries that have nothing to do with their whatever their chosen political organization is.
No, that's a very good point. And yeah, I suppose unfortunately, I know you're right. I think we tend to think very negatively a lot about these countries, and it doesn't help probably, especially when we live outside of them. We often only hear the negatives, really.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like we rarely, for example, do we even hear about countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, that have advanced, developed themselves very, very impressively, and even like I didn't even know this until like the recent kind of issue. Issue is probably a loose term here, but the rise of the Omicron variant, the new COVID variant. It was it was picked up by scientists in South Africa, and it was picked up by them or discovered rather because they actually in South Africa have they're very advanced in that field of microbiology basically. But the way kind of it got spun in the news was that it's a South African variant, which is not actually the case. But it's a very good point, and we should look to a lot of the advances that have been made within these countries and continue to be made, whether it's in areas of like media, like we've seen with Ertugrul and so on, or whether it's in even infrastructure like Turkey. The new airport in Istanbul is very impressive. Turkey's rail system is as well. I've heard is quite good. Things like that. I suppose that for me the concern is when you look at these nations, we already know you're under huge pressure. We've touched on it already. Kind of the soft power that is exerted by the likes of the America and Western Europe, European nations. There's a lot of hard power involved as well, though, and we're seeing through the rise of China. Similarly, whether their approach is different, from like the likes of the U.S. and Europe, but they are very much exerting themselves in nations such as Pakistan, as well as many African nations and others. And so I suppose that will be a huge challenge now for these nations, and especially for Afghanistan as well, kind of being under this new regime, and how do they handle that?
Yeah.
What was the challenge you're saying for a lot of these countries?
I guess the challenge is how do you, I guess,
Resisting kind of foreign hard power.
Yeah.
Sure, that's been the situation for the last several hundred years. It's ongoing. Yeah, but there's two things I want to respond to based on some of the things that were just said. One is just to note that even though we point to a lot of Turkey's achievements, it is actually technically like constitutionally a secular democracy. But this is where we get into what Marie was talking about, the different definitions of secularism, because like no one's going to say that like Erdogan and the AKP are like a very secular party. They're very clearly like an Islamist party and are drawing upon their Islamic credentials to rule. So that's a great example of why the issue is so nebulous, you know. But yeah, that's just one thing I wanted to mention. And then another thing is, and you're talking about how there's an ongoing attempt to spread Euro-American norms, be it by hard power, soft power, cultural power, whatever else. Something that's happened for but ongoing for the last couple of 100 years. And you're talking about, what was you also mentioned earlier, I suppose, what would be more successful, current efforts to conform to secularism or whatever else, or to return to the past. And I think, despite wherever you go in the future, what's important when navigating the pressure of a culturally hegemonic Western bloc. What's important when navigating pressure from them and interventionism from them is to realize that for a lot of the last several hundred years, they have been operating off a principle of universalism, that their civilization and cultural and political norms are a universal civilization, which is the end of history. And this is something that came about as a result of the Enlightenment. And it's something that was is evidenced by the attempts to spread liberal democracy and the attempts in the 20th century to spread communism, because communism was an Enlightenment ideology. And what's really, really important to note about this, universalism that is being exerted by Euro-America, and is obviously very much tied in with imperialism, is that it assumes that all the cultures and institutional norms of everyone outside of Europe can be reduced and can be removed, and that Euro-American norms can be adopted. That's the assumption. That's how that universalism makes sense. And what's been really, really obvious, and this sort of triumphalism with the assumption of their universality, this sort of came to a peak right after the end of the Cold War. Okay, we've defeated communism, and now our civilization can be universal. Mm-hmm. And why that was incredibly stupid was because, one, they just defeated another European ideology. So you actually just, in a weird way, you were defeating yourself, because you were just another European ideology which was trying to be universal. And then two, why that was silly was because all of those countries in the post Cold War period who were forced to adopt Euro-American norms in terms of economics and political governance just had a terrible time. Like Russia in the 90s adopting Euro-American norms and democracy in terms of its economics, politics, it went so badly that now we have like a resurgent Russia under Putin that is completely revolting against the West. And this is that's a great example of why that assumption of cultural reduction was such a failure. That the responses to Euro-American inspired authoritarianism. There's a lot to unpack there based on what I'm just saying. But what's important to note is that not only for Muslims and for Islamic civilizations, but you can't just assume that their cultures and institutions are just going to fade away and adopt a foreign ideology. And same for like African countries, South American. It's a society and a country has to be formed on a consensus that everyone has a sort of common culture and belief in the institutions. And that's one of the reasons why America is tearing itself apart today, is because their common consensus doesn't really exist anymore. So I hope that sort of all kind of made sense. I was kind of zigzagging, but the point is that okay, so can we get past secularism or return something to the past? It's the wrong question. We can't reduce our cultures and change and reduce what is there and just adopt secularism. It's actually just a flawed premise. That the idea that you just become something you're not. unless you're like Russia and China, who just spent decades massively recreating their societies. It's just not a feasible project. So what is feasible for a lot of countries is for them to take a hard look at their values, hard look at their cultures, hard look at what their people need and want, and create an authentic system for economic and political life. Economics goes poorly when it's not authentic, and the same goes for politics and culture. That was all sort of a big spiel, but I hope that sort of made a bit of sense about how countries can manage their relationship with secularism.
No, that was very, very, very interesting, and it's yeah, the kind of I feel like there's always just especially with America, they like to just pick one kind of villain. So like before it was Soviet Russia and communism, and since then it's war on drugs, then war on terrorism, and so on and so on. It's always just kind of one one big bad basically. Um, but no, it's interesting. I think your point, especially on authenticity, is important there. And that would be for me. That would be the big takeaway: is that just as kind of uh, each kind of caliphate that has existed or each empire has existed has been different according to the different kind of cultures of the people. Um, we have to take kind of a similar approach. Can't just have a one, try and just copy paste a solution that you know that or something that looks like a solution for one place and then put it somewhere else. I mean, really, that is what secularism exactly has tried to do. And we've seen that it doesn't work, and it causes many, many issues. So, no, I think that's a really, really great point.
And you take that exact principle and put it anywhere. Just taking something and chucking it somewhere else without respecting what's already there. That's just taking away secularism. It's the same thing. Like with any ideology, it's the same way why communism was so very virulently, violently rejected in so much of the Muslim world. But right now, like Turkey's coming back from communism, Afghanistan rejected communism. Right now in Central Asia, in countries which were secular socialist countries for the entire 20th century, there is actually an Islamic revival going on in some of these countries. So you can see that just the imposition of alien culture and politics is and economics even is it's just not feasible or clever or desirable. Another great example, specific for economics, is how Africa under African socialism from the 50s until the 70s had about 3% economic growth every year. But from the 70s onwards, with the introduction of Euro-American neoliberal economic policies, which were very much pushed through international institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, which is the same institutions which encouraged neoliberal ideology in Russia and post-communist states, is that they actually reduced economic growth in both Africa and post-communist states. From the 50s, 70s, it was 3%. From the 70s up until the 21st century, it was 1.5%. And again, in Russia and some of these other post-communist countries, their economic development was just completely went terrible after the forced, it was called shock therapy, just shocking them into neoliberal economics. So yeah, that point about authenticity in terms of an authentic political and economic and cultural life, it's very, very important. And I think it engages with a lot of different ideas, but not like engages with the idea of not having an inferiority complex, about respecting the values and culture of people. There's a lot of different things you can draw in to sort of defend the idea of the importance of authenticity. But how authentic is secularism, guys? I don't know.
Well, there's this one argument actually that Islam resists attempts to secularize because of the kind of resilience of its authentic traditions and like the prevalence and the resilience of like the traditional religious frameworks. Well, we haven't, as Muslims, like broadly speaking, we haven't abandoned the traditional Islamic sciences. We haven't abandoned the traditional religious studies. And it's not like the Islamic scholars have found themselves completely kind of blown out of the water and completely in over their heads and unable to deal with the challenges of the modern world. Islam is finding ways of authentically and holistically responding to the challenges of modernity without losing itself in it. And I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, you can tie it back to وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, and hold firmly to the rope of Allah and do not go astray. That if we hold on to the fundamentals of the deen and its principles, we can, inshallah, kind of weather all storms.
Absolutely. I mean, who would have, if you would imagine if you were, a Muslim living at the time of, Genghis Khan, I'm pretty sure you would have thought, that's it, this is over.
Yeah.
It's always easy to think in the time, I think in the time you're living in, that, we're nearing the end times, or that there's no coming back, there's no improving from this. But, we've seen Islam persevere through more difficult things than what many of us go through. And yeah, it will continue to persevere. Inshallah, Muslims will continue to persevere.
Yeah, that's right. It's like we were talking about how there's that sense of inferiority, that that internal external pressure to conform to form norms. But like one time we just like sometimes we just need to sit in the mirror, like sit down, look in the mirror, and tell ourselves, Islam came in the 7th century and was a world power for like 1,300 years straight. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it was only up until like the 20th century, that there wasn't an Islamic world power. You know what I mean? So like if you take that into account, like how can you? It's impossible to devalue and to undermine the achievement and success that Islamic civilizations have wrought. It completely undermines the argument that that religion, like you were saying, one of the definitions of secularism is that it's the people stop being religious and become secular, right? And that's how people evolve. Again, that's that Enlightenment European conception of what ideological evolution is. But if you take that 1,300 year power, powering for 1,300 years of powering forward, it just completely undermines that religion and it undermines success in politics and economics and civilization. And that we need something foreign from ourselves to be successful, because that wasn't the case. You might even argue the opposite, that our abandoning of Islamic principles is what might have been what.
Yeah. Allowed divisions and civil wars and whatnot to come between us, issues of nationalism and race and.
Yep.
Absolutely. And I think that's a fantastic note to conclude things on for today. It was a really interesting discussion. I think we touched on a lot of things. Yeah, I find this, I'm very much a layperson when it comes to kind of these kind of topics, but I do find it interesting discussing them. It's a great opportunity for me to learn myself as well. I think it's something that definitely, gets talked about a lot, as it should. But at the same time, I think a lot of people, including myself, are probably still not as aware on this issue as probably we should be, and kind of in general, what it even mean, what secularism even means, and kind of how often it's used, perhaps differently than what it actually is, and so on. So like Jazakallah khair to you both. This was a really good conversation. Inshallah, hopefully all of you listening and watching enjoyed it, and yes, just stay tuned for the next episode, inshallah. From all of us here at Finding Islam, Assalamu alaikum.